Hey, Brad, how's it going?
Hey, Chris. Things are good. I am off site today. I'm hanging in Vancouver, BC.
So you're from Hamilton, which is near Toronto.
That's
Is
right.
that correct?
I am from Hamilton, Ontario, just 45 minutes outside of Toronto.
So help for us Americans who think Canada's just all one thing. So tell me you're in Vancouver, how are they different for you? Hamilton, Toronto, Vancouver, BC. Yeah.
A lot of people look to Vancouver in Canada. They talk about it kind of like it's almost Canada's California. A lot of people from different parts of Canada go there for a little while. They move out there and then they eventually trounce back to wherever it was they came from. Um, but yeah, it's a beautiful place. If you're really into the outdoors and stuff. Um, Brielle and I aren't as much. That's not really our thing.
We're not
So
really outdoorsy.
we're not outdoorsy folk. Don't go climbing mountains and stuff. Like I like a hike here and there, sure, but Toronto and Hamilton, they're older, they're
Hmm.
more historical cities. So they're a little grungier in a lot of ways, but we're big fans of where we're from. But I do love coming out here to visit. So we're here to see some family.
Hey man, as a child, grew up in the '90s, '80s and '90s. You talk grunge. I'm down with some grunge.
You're there.
What have you been thinking about lately?
This week, I am thinking about sages. And what I mean by that is those religious and cultural figures that are just widely revered by many different people. I'm interested in talking about how mindful Christians should relate to, these figures in other religions or other movements, because I think that's been a real weak spot in the church's history.
Hmm.
And so I thought, let's dig into talking about the sage today.
Great. You want to talk about that?
I would be game.
Freestyle Theology is sponsored by Daily Breath, the Christian meditation app that really works. Learn more at dailybreath.app.
Brad, to start out to help us get our minds around what you're talking about with the sage, cultural sage, religious sage, can you start with a specific example that a lot of us would know? Like, instead of just kind of going broad, is there one specific one? And then let's kind of tease that one out and play off of that.
Well, let's talk about Muhammad.
Okay.
I think, throughout the Western church's history, Islam has been in a lot of ways the rival of Christendom. And actually, for throughout the Middle Ages, a lot of just your kind of average Western European really saw the world in terms of there was Christendom and Dar al
Mm-hmm.
Islam. And it was like there was like a mirror image of each other, Let's try to get that right there. And both had a lot of similarities in this and kind of how they structured society, right? But we know from our history of the Crusades and stuff that that was often a very grim relationship, right? How they related to
Right.
one another. Yeah, there's a lot of areas right along the borderlands where people were kind of forced to get along in some way. I mean, in Spain, which was the majority of Spain was an Islamic caliphate for centuries. And eventually in 1492, the same year that Ferdinand and Isabella sponsored Columbus to
Sail the ocean blue.
try to find India by sailing west. That was the same year that the
Hmm.
Catholic Spaniards completely reconquered all of the Spanish or Iberian Peninsula,
Huh.
and then forced Muslims to either convert or leave. So, but before that, there had been cities that were both Muslims and Christians lived and found a way to get along.
Hmm.
But that all aside, I'm actually thinking about how Christians have kind of related and talked about Muhammad.
Even on that, you're going to 1492 and be kind of around in there. But the issue, the fight, the war between kind of Christendom in the West and Islam, it didn't start in 2000, like for us, for Americans, like with 9/11. It didn't start in 2001. It didn't start in the maybe in the '80s with the Iran Contra. Like this, what you're saying, it didn't go. It predates the United States. It predates Canada. It goes all the way back.
Yeah, it's an old one, and a big reason for that is Islam was a lot like Christendom in that it could expand by conquering new territory, which I think we talked about that. Was it last week? Maybe sort of that Germanic impulse within Western Christianity to conquer land. And by conquering land, you establish Christian law over new people. And so in a weird and, from my view, kind of twisted way, but it makes sense culturally, to conquer was to evangelize. And in a lot of ways, Islam was like that for a lot of its history.
This is like another episode. I don't want to get us too far afield. I know what you just said is right. And I know that's how Christendom, like there was a conquering, like that's how it would conquer, it would do that. But I just realized even in my own brain, that's so, it still flinches away from the nice narrative that I normally have of like, no, it's like these missionaries would go and would convert the common people, grassroots, and then, or St. Patrick, and he went to Ireland and then preached the gospel. It's people going and preaching the gospel. But there is more of a militaristic, you're saying, all throughout. Christendom had that, doing it by power, bringing conversion by power, and violence, I suppose.
Yeah. And I mean, those overlap, because within these larger sort of religious political structures of Christendom, there was, missionaries and monks who were doing that grassroots stuff. It's full of contradictions. Like some people in small villages may have been they might have found a lot of life in the gospel, even as their society was being kind of enveloped into this new political structure. So like I often say, there's no final word on any of this stuff. There's just a lot to say. It's just important to note that Islam and Christendom were similar. So it just made me start thinking about Muhammad. And this is not a podcast where I'm going to like delve into the life of Muhammad. That's not really what I'm even prepared to talk about. I'm more just looking at his role as the sage of Arabia, and I've heard this stuff myself, some Christian attempts to interpret Muhammad and what he was all about have kind of gone into some crazy territory, talking about how he was, demon possessed, that somehow like Satan used Muhammad to deceive, millions. And I am sure that that's not a good way to think of it, but I think we need a new way of talking and relating to figures like Muhammad, like Buddha, or even figures like Joseph Smith of the Mormon, he is the Mormon sage. And you can not like that. You cannot like anything he says, but the fact is he is a sage, whatever you think about it, because he's this key figure for millions of people. And I actually think that extends even to figures like Sigmund Freud, or even Vivienne Westwood, founder of the like kind of punk movement. I think we might benefit from starting to treat these people with respect because of how they are so revered by others.
I was going to say it's a joke, and then I'm going to quit interrupting you. But I was going to say this is a joke, and then as I didn't say it, because I'm like, just stop interrupting. And I was like, oh no, this is actually, it probably falls right along what you're saying. Taylor Swift is the sage of a generation.
That is, and see, but the thing is, it makes us feel uncomfortable, right, to say that. But you actually, what you're doing is taking seriously what, I don't know, what age of people listen to Taylor Swift? Like
I would say from 15 to 35.
Okay.
There is a generation from 15 years old to 35 who Taylor Swift, through her music, through the years, has told and interpreted life through her story, through her songs.
Totally.
Okay,
and so,
keep going.
No, that's actually really good. Because you said it. I felt uncomfortable. I'm like thinking of these big religious figures, but you're like Taylor Swift. It's like, and how many times have we gotten into like intergenerational tension because the older generation is like, oh, why are you listening not just to the music, but to this garbage, or you need to return to the classics or something like that. But it's like taking people seriously, taking your neighbor seriously means taking the sages in their life seriously. And you can't, take everyone seriously. But I feel like that's why it's one of my favorite parts of kind of the Christian vision is the focus is on the neighbor. The focus is not on all people, because none of us is capable of showing love to all people. It's just, that's just a platitude. That's not even a thing, right? But in
Mm.
reality, we love our neighbor, the people that are in our path on our day-to-day life, you know?
Mhm.
And so, you know, I live in a neighborhood that has a pretty large Muslim immigrant population. So like our public park is, a lot of my kids' friends there are Muslims. And I have to take Islam and therefore Muhammad seriously if I want to show any kind of love for these people. And not in like some strategic way where it's like, I'm going to learn everything I can about Muhammad so that I can like deconstruct it and like put Jesus in its place. It's like, that is an agenda. That's not real friendship, first of all, you know?
Mhm.
So Muhammad as the Arabian sage, I just think that that can shift how because we don't have to go down this road where we just have to say, oh, all religions, they're all the same, they're all aimed at the exact same thing, because that actually is a disrespectful thing to say, because
How so?
adherents of these different faiths wouldn't just want, like, that would seem like such a Western thing to do, to take their like great traditions, to take like their books of scripture, their wise guidance, right? And just to collapse it all into some, oh, they're all the same. You know?
So there is, yeah, because there is some sort of like, because I have my Western 21st century rationalistic, and I can now see and I can understand that yours is just, it's still me, it's me sitting on top above all the other ones and saying, I understand how it's kind of, it's like pedantic. It feels like it's like patting them
Exactly.
on the head, like, oh, that's cute. It's cute what you do with your thing. But it's realizing like, wait, I'm not putting myself alongside all those other ones. I'm saying my way of understanding. Okay. Yep.
Yeah. And I think it's just important to note that, you know, Muhammad will be around a lot longer than you. Like, Muhammad is not going anywhere. So this is not a temporary flash in the pan. Like, we're talking about one of the greatest sages in human history that millions of people found.
So to take your Canadian, I don't know why I keep making this about Canada and America, whatever, with you, but to take Jordan Peterson, like he's a sage for sure today, especially among young white men. The question is, will he be a sage who's revered in 100 years? Maybe, maybe not. But I can tell you that in 100 years from now, Muhammad will be revered by a large portion of the world's population.
Yeah, more
okay.
than right now. So
yeah.
What I'm trying to find is like to kind of navigate a new way into how we love the other or our neighbor, you know, and your neighbors might not be your community at all. People who live in, you know, northern Alberta, one of the provinces in Canada, they're going to have a lot more interaction with Indigenous people, and loving their neighbor might be really understanding the Cree worldview and some of the wisdom that the Cree people have. That might just be part of living well and kind of knowing and loving your neighbor in northern Alberta. And yeah, we live in highly pluralistic societies where there's every kind of religion or worldview in operation at all the times, right? But you know the circles you're in and the kind of things that people are reading. So like Brielle and I are being exposed more and more to people who are into mindfulness, right? As I've talked about a few times. And that for me, that started out trying to just understand what that was all about. Why were people so drawn to this kind of path? And so it did make me kind of revisit my sort of assumptions about the Buddha. Like, I did have to revisit that and realize that a lot of my stereotypes or my quick answers about why Buddhism was wrong kind of like broke down. It didn't leave me feeling like a desire to shift or convert to a new religion. It just made me realize like the richness of this sage.
What have you learned as you've thought about Buddhism in this context? Like, what have you learned to appreciate about the Buddha and about him as a sage?
Well, I feel like the Buddha, his goal was not, as with most religious figures, was not to start a new religion. That is rarely the goal. And when that is the goal, that's when you kind of are like, am I in like cult territory, right? Like, we're starting a new religion. Because most of the religious sages were just attempting to.
Is it fair to say then, from like Muhammad was not trying to start a new religion. What was he trying to do?
I mean, was he trying to start a new religion? Not
I think he was trying
really.
to find a renewal, or
Muhammad was trying to help the Arabian people to realize that there was just one God.
okay,
Because he was mostly in Muhammad's life, he was mostly interacting, like his focus was kind of on the polytheistic Arabian worship of multiple gods. But Islam is also really complicated in its history because it is directly tied to Christian communities. Like these are not, there was a lot of Christian communities in the Arabian Peninsula, right? In fact, Yemen was actually a Christian kingdom initially. So we should do another episode where we talk about the early history of Islam because it's really fascinating. But there was a lot of the conquest of, you know, what we might call like Middle Eastern Christian lands. So like Egypt and, you know, what used to be Roman North Africa. A lot, like Islam goes through there and conquers it very quickly, right? But the fact is a lot of Christians in those territories welcomed Islam because they had started to associate, even though they had their own sort of like the Coptic Christians, right? Even though there had been their own language of Christianity, they didn't consider themselves to be like beholden to Rome. The Roman Byzantine Christianity was really like flexing its muscles on them because those who were in Egypt and other places like did have different theological formulations, especially about how the nature of Christ worked. Did he have one? Was he fully God? Was he fully man? Was he both? Was it a mixture, right? The Middle Eastern Christians did have a different way of talking about the natures of Christ. And the Roman Byzantine way or the Chalcedonian way just was like, that's heresy. And it wasn't heresy. It was like we talked about last time. It was just a different cultural framework. So it kind of like, in a way, had been theologically colonized and beaten down for a long time by the Chalcedonians. So they welcomed
these new. Wow, I suppose you could say Jesus wasn't trying to form a new religion. Like he wasn't trying to found a new religion.
Yeah, not at all. And I've heard
coming in
people
fulfilling the story of Israel.
Right. Fulfilling the story of Israel as their Messiah. And even, I mean, his followers would have seen themselves as followers of the crucified Messiah, which would have sounded really bizarre to even their Jewish compatriots, right? What do you mean he's the Messiah if he's crucified? That's sort of how we know he isn't the Messiah because he was killed, right? And God would not let his Holy One rot in the grave. And they're like, well, he didn't, right? So yeah, it didn't start a new religion. And then it's interesting because in other places, like I can't remember exactly where, Persia, maybe Syria, you know, followers of Jesus were called Nazarenes. That was their title, the Nazarenes. As opposed, and I think in some communities still is. So not Christians, but Nazarenes. And I don't know, there's some real interesting.
That's interesting. All right. So Buddha, you learned from Buddha. He's not trying to start a new religion.
Not trying to start a new religion. And also realizing that what Siddhartha Gautama or the Buddha was about was sort of why we suffer and how to move through and past suffering. And I didn't know that. I had always just thought Buddhism was kind of a different religion with a different story. But Siddhartha Gautama would actually not like actively, because he's from India, right? So very religious place. He would actively not comment on some of the more cosmological questions. He didn't have an answer and didn't try to about where suffering came from, like where its origins were. He didn't talk about the origins of the universe or anything like that. And he would kind of say, I'm just here to talk about suffering, why we suffer, and how to alleviate it. So this isn't really me coming on talking about why I think the Buddha's method for alleviating suffering is true or not. That might be a different discussion. All it is that it's intriguing to me, his sort of method, which is mindfulness, becoming grounded and aware of the moment that you're in and approaching it with acceptance, kind of like we talked about a few weeks ago, grows your capacity to bear suffering. And I don't fully know I don't have a position. I wanted to say this in an earlier podcast, but this is not a podcast where I am giving you positions on things. It's it's postures, not positions. So that's why I feel free to just kind of discuss this stuff openly. And I'm not signing my name on anything. I am riffing, musing, kind of trying to go down some rabbit holes and,
almost like wondering freely aloud.
wondering freely out loud, freestyling about theology.
Let me say this and see if this connects, and try to, I want you to land the plane for us with kind of drive it. You said what you're trying to do is not, say it again, not give you a position, but kind
Posture.
of in, almost like like demonstrate a posture that one could have towards it. This really struck. This is something I was just thinking this a few minutes before you said that. But I mean, when we want to get a position, it's like, I want to know, is Islam, Muhammadan Islam, is it right or wrong? Is it true or false? That's a question we can ask, and we need a position on it. Is the Buddha's take on how to alleviate suffering, is that true or false, right or wrong? And we need to take a position on that. Now, you're not even speaking to, are we taking a bit, like, that's not the point, but a posture. And so this is, if as followers of Jesus, if as a Christian, we're not trying to figure out what's right, and how do I say this? We're not trying to figure out what the right position on everything in the world is, or because then we're thinking like principles. What's the principle behind this, or house? But we're trying to say, as Christians, this is the story of the world, and we believe these things have happened. That these things have happened in the midst of the story. That with Jesus, the Messiah, like you talked about, died, rose again, and he's coming again. Okay, so if that is the key of history, and history is moving forward, and we're in the midst of the story, the question you're asking is like, how do we stand, or what's our posture towards our neighbors? And we say, hey, I'm not telling you, I'm not trying to take a position on all these things. I'm just trying to say, hey, this is what I think has been revealed to me. I think is the true story of the world. And now I want in that, all these things are a part of this world, and I love you as my neighbor. And because I love you, I want to know and understand, and where can I even value the people who you think are sages, who are sages to you. And then I can look at the Buddha and I can say, I'm not trying to give you a position on, is it the right or the wrong? But this is someone who for a lot of years people have looked to and followed his way and tried to understand. And you'd even say, like, oh, I've even tried some of his stuff, and it even fills in something that has been lacking in my Christian tradition. But this is all God's world. And so because I have this open posture to it, it's not saying I'm going to go and become a Buddhist and change my religion, but it's saying, because I have an open posture, I can receive something good from this sage that is actually helping my own mental health, helping my experience, helping alleviate pain and suffering in my own life.
Right. And helping us to grow, to become more fully human. Because in a way, that's, you said in something missing in our own Christian tradition, right? And that reminds me of one other really important thing to say is, as I was kind of musing about this topic before we started talking, I thought of that passage where Jesus says, a person cannot serve two masters, right? And I thought, am I like going into territory where I'm like, we can serve two masters? But I realized no, because first of all, Western Christians deeply revere especially two key sages in particular, Plato and Aristotle. Plato and Aristotle are Greek sages. That's what they are. And that's how they should be treated. They were monumental figures whose thought shaped and transformed not just like the intellectual world, but the actual like political, cultural world that they were in, right? And they often get this free pass, and they have for a long time in, Roman and Greek Christianity. And it's kind of like, without really thinking, like, I know that there was people who opposed that. People like Tertullian, if you ever heard of him. He was like, we need to just ditch everything to do with the Greek philosophical world. But there was something about these figures and what they had to say that was magnetic, and people kept coming back to it because it gave a lot of life. It had good things to say, right? So we treat Plato and Aristotle like in the Roman Empire, people talked about them. They called them that they were Christians before Christ, which is a really bold claim. But the problem is not in taking both the story of Jesus deadly seriously and the cultural figures of Plato and Aristotle. That's not the problem. That is what everybody does. And that's what we should do, because we have to take our own world and the wisdom that we've received seriously, right? It's that it got blended into a thing that we're like, this is Christianity. Christianity is the story of Christ and kind of rendered through these Greek philosophical categories. No, that is not Christianity.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Having like pastoring for 20 years, I'm telling you, I just assume the default is that people have Plato/Aristotle's worldview and they're running their Christianity through that. So it's not even that like they're side by side. It's like, oh, it's Plato's framework and some Aristotle. Like that's actually, it's not that like they're a sage side by side Jesus. They're actually the main sage that people are living by.
Right. And then the kind of the Jesus stuff gets inserted in.
Mm-hmm.
But like and some of these questions don't have an easy answer, but it's like, if Jesus rose from the dead and is coming again to heal all things, then what do we say about Buddha's technique for alleviating suffering? Like, given the first thing, they don't seem connected, but I don't have the answer. I don't think anybody has the answer to that question. And it's not accurate to just go, well, we don't need Buddha or the teachings because we have Jesus. And it's just kind of like, yeah, but the figure brings life to people. And so I don't actually fully know. I know that we treat, and then there's like characters like Luther and Calvin. Those are sages as well. Those are cultural and like theological sages, but we treat them like they're in a different category. I don't know, maybe it's because they are Western Christians, or even more recent people like Kuyper, Bavinck, stuff like that. These are all sages.
Our church, for several years, we rented from a Lutheran church, and I got to know the pastor. He's wonderful. And like we'd worship with them sometimes, and it's like, gosh, they are all about Luther is their sage. And it's really helpful to think about. He's a hero of he's a sage. I grew up Methodist. John Wesley is the sage in that tradition. And I think like, as I was getting to know Pastor Garrett, that's what I did. It wasn't like, gosh, you guys are way too much about Luther. You're right. It's like, no, I want to respect that. And that's what I kind of leaned in and like, what do I need to learn from his life? What do I need to, yeah.
And if you ended up in a community that was like heavily Lutheran, it would be really foolish of you to just kind of remain ignorant of Luther,
Yeah.
So I think we have to, it's about sort of taking our own context, the moment we find ourselves in, seriously, and really ask that question, like, because I think we have this idea of other religions that they're just, and the very idea that there is other religions is itself a 19th century Western academic construction, because the field of comparative religions was founded as a way of analyzing and studying non-Christian religions. And it's a systematic approach that kind of tries to put them beside each other and make them like, here's what Christianity said about this, here's what Buddhism says about it. Right?
I was trying to figure out how to get it and wrap this podcast up, and then you just dropped that. What?
Yeah, comparative religions.
What's the other option? Like, how did people see it before that in the 17th century?
Well, they probably this is really fascinating, but by the time of, let's say, the time of Columbus, okay, so like the turn of the 16th century, the Western Christians kind of world was very small, and it was you're either Christian or Muslim. That was it. They knew that there used to be pagans, which they called them, right? There used to be pagans, and they thought maybe somewhere off in the distance, China, I think. They didn't know anything, right?
There's no communication.
None.
There's no printing press.
Right. And so
all you know is, okay, yep, this makes sense.
When these, Europeans go to the Americas for the first time, accidentally, to, the Bahamas and then the different islands, and then when they tell people back in Europe about these people, which they call pagan or heathens, and if you weren't there in the Americas, so you see these drawings that Europeans drew of indigenous people, and they draw them wearing togas, because that's their cultural memory of what a pagan is. It's someone from the ancient Greek world. So like there was a picture drawn of the Iroquois Council, and they draw them all in togas. It looks like a meeting of like Roman senators. So that's another topic. But what I'm really trying to communicate is to truly and deeply love one's neighbor. We talk about that, right? Loving your neighbor. And we know that has something to do with showing empathy, when there's struggle, lending a helping hand, stuff like that. But it also means taking the figures that they revere, even if you really don't find anything of insight in their revered figure, taking them seriously. Because if you want to love neighbors and make friends, real, genuine friendships, there's no other way.
Thanks, Brad. This has been fun.
this has been a wild ride.
We should do this again sometime. You want to do it again next week?
You took the words right out of my mouth.
Freestyle Theology is sponsored by Daily Breath, the Christian meditation app that really works. Learn more at dailybreath.app. That's daily, BREADTH.app. Or try it for free by downloading it in the Apple App Store or on Google Play.